Welcome to PPI Conversations, an opportunity to connect with leading edge thinkers and leaders and discuss today's pressing topics in the engineering and construction industry. With your host, PPI Executive Director Gary Fischer. We at PPI address the root cause of major capital project cost and schedule overruns through the research and dissemination of project production management and its foundation of operations science. Enjoy the conversation.
Well, hello, everyone. Gary Fischer here from the Project Production Institute. Today, we have a special treat in store for you. Let me introduce Simon Murray, who I've found, as we've been kind of getting to know each other, is a real kindred spirit in the pursuit of lifetime learning and better ways of handling capital projects. So let's get right into the conversation. Welcome, Simon. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here, Gary.
Instead of me reading off a paragraph of your history, I think it'd be more impactful if you tell the audience about, man, you have a really interesting background. Can you tell the audience about yourself, how you got into the position today, and what you're up to now?
Yeah, well, Gary, I'm a classic post-war baby boomer. So, grew up in the 1950s, 1960s. And I kind of from teenage years wanted to be an engineer, influenced by an uncle of mine. And so I went off to Imperial College in 1970, Imperial College London, studied civil engineering, graduated in 73. And I think I was the last person in my class to get a job. I just didn't know what I wanted to do. So eventually I got a job in a government research station doing geotechnical research. And it was great fun, but I couldn't face the thought of doing a PhD. So I joined the consultant Arup, who you probably know. I joined them in South Africa. And I spent the next 10 years working for them, mostly in Africa and in Asia. And on civil engineering projects, generally, foundations and civil engineering, quite a lot of big excavations and tunneling. And I was looking back on it, I was determined to get as much experience, much practical experience as I could before I was in my mid-30s. Yeah. And I succeeded doing that. And then in 1984, came back to the UK to work for Arup in London. And I still was doing most of my work abroad. And Arup was it was then and probably still is an amazing place to work. It's like a cross between a university and a consulting firm. Great people, lots of opportunity, and the leadership then, because when I joined, Ove Arup himself was still around. But back then, they were remarkably tolerant of people like me who didn't quite conform, to the classic Arup structural engineer kind of model. I began, I did a lot of interesting things. For a while, I was one of the two partners in Arup Economic Consulting. And that's where I started getting involved in setting up projects and funding projects and things like that. But I began to realize that my principal interest was actually in the whole process of creating and delivering investments in infrastructure, rather than in the technical engineering for which Arup is so rightly famous. And eventually, like many people, we have this expression, us graduates of Arup, we fall off the edge of the company. So I ended up in 1994. I was a director by then. I decided, I remember somebody asked me, why did you move when you'd achieved all that? And I said, I could already see my own retirement party. And so I decided to move, and I had this fantastic opportunity to join the airport operator, BAA. As development director, and I kind of grabbed it with both hands. And I think later on in this conversation, we'll probably talk a bit more about my time at BAA.
Yeah.
But I mean, after that, after that move, spent most of that next stage of my career in large infrastructure companies. First of all, 4 years at BAA, and then I was on the board of Railtrack, as our national infrastructure operator. And Railtrack got itself into a lot of trouble with the government, and this is back in 2001. And eventually I didn't really have a job there anymore. I was the director of major projects. And so I left and decided I didn't want to be in the corporate world anymore. I decided to set up my own consultancy business. And so I suppose since then I've combined consultancy with non-executive jobs. which I found really stimulating. So I spent 9 years as non-executive chairman of a family-owned construction company. Unfortunately, not my family, but it doesn't matter. And I've spent 6 years on the board as a non-executive director on the board of our national highway company, Highways England, now National Highways. And right now, I'm a non-executive director of East West Rail, where we are building the railway from Oxford to Cambridge.
Wow. That's quite a history. I like it. But fell off the edge of the company. That's an interesting way to launch to a different type of career.
Yeah, I think it happens to all of us. And in fact, I think what's been so interesting looking at some of your videos and also through all the friends I've got to meet in PPI is how many people have had that experience, have started off one career path and then through that met people and, you know, decided that there was something else they wanted to do.
Yeah, I can share that. I relate to that 100%. So let's get a little more personal. What are the top 3 things you've learned along the way in your career you would advise some person just coming out of college?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you gave me a bit of warning of this one, so I thought a lot about it actually over the last couple of days. My top, well, I wouldn't say they're in order. They are all equally important, these 3. My first one would be curious. You know, one of the high points of my career was the 3 years, or nearly 4 years, I spent working for Sir John Egan, who was chief executive of the airport operator BAA, formerly chairman of Jaguar Cars, engineer and manufacturer to his right, you know, right down to his toes, obsessed with process improvement, great man. John's philosophy was that most of the problems we faced in the company had already been solved by somebody else, either in another sector or in another country. So essentially what he expected us to do was to go out there all over the world, find the solutions and bring them back to BAA. I can remember, you know, when I worked for him and I had my fortnightly one-to-one meetings with him, his very first question was always, where have you been? Who have you met? And I think that stayed with me. That he was a truly curious man. Yeah. In the sense of always looking for new ideas, always looking for new people, and it sort of rubbed off on me. My second one, which kind of grows out of that, the second key point is look after your networks. You know, unless you're lucky to have the kind of job like, I don't know, a novelist or a professional poker player that you do on your own. Yeah. All of us rely on other people to get things done. And also we rely on other people for intellectual stimulation. And I think it's so important that we invest in those relationships and not just build the networks of friends, but look after people. And one of the things I have learned the hard way is that if you want to have a good network of friends, you've got to give with no expectation of receiving. You know, if you give to people because you like them, because you're interested in what they're doing, or you just feel they're good people, it might take months, it might take years, but in the end, you get something back for it. And even if you don't get anything back for it, at least you have the satisfaction of done it. I mean, and I was thinking about this again this morning, that I mean, there's still relationships with, I mean, I nurture a lot of relationships, including with friends in PPI. I mean, there are 4 of my dearest friends and closest colleagues. With the 5 of us, have a monthly date. And we've done it right through the pandemic, actually. Originally, we used to go to a family Italian restaurant once a month, just for dinner and a chat. And then through the pandemic, it became, you know, a monthly online glass of wine together. There's no agenda, you know, it's just we're mates. And I think the more you can do that, the better. My third learning point is that I've found in my career that influence is more satisfying than power. And in addition, it's much more fun. Unfortunately, our career, when we go into big companies, we're sort of encouraged to seek power, to seek promotion, to seek authority. Yeah. And I've found, probably just through some of the things I've done, that actually doing things which influence other people's thought is much more satisfying. You know, if I look at it more widely, we will all remember, you know, Henry Ford and Tim Berners-Lee and Nelson Mandela long after all the alpha male CEOs that we talk about are no longer around, and also long after most politicians have just been consigned to the history books. So those would be my three: be curious, look after your networks, and try to be influential rather than powerful.
Wow, those are really good. We could stop there, publish it. This would be fantastic. Those are really good, very insightful. Thanks for taking the time to collect your thoughts on that and present it in such a succinct way. That was really good. So you first got connected with project production management at BAA on the Heathrow Terminal 5 project. Tell us the story of that. You must have been searching for answers somehow.
I have to take you a little bit of background in order to understand what we were doing there. After World War II, the British government nationalised almost all of our economic infrastructure, railways, all the rest of it. And then in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, and she set about a process of privatising it again. And so, public authorities like the British Airports Authority became BAA PLC. And there was a problem here, which was some of these were monopolies. So in order to deal with that problem, the government created what we call regulators. Now, these are statutory bodies whose job, they each one relates to a particular industry. And their job in that industry is to control the prices that the privatized companies are allowed to charge their customers, and to control them in such a way that they reflect what the market would have achieved. So that's the background. So when I joined BAA in 1994, it was regulated by the Civil Aviation Authority. And the prices we were charging the airlines for the services we provided, they were regulated at the time. I think it was minus 2% per annum in real terms. So every year, our charges to the airlines went down by 2% in real terms. And at the same time, our construction costs, basic cost of building our infrastructure, were going up at more than 4% per annum. Yeah. And when I joined, the company had committed to and just started planning to spend more than £3 billion on the new Terminal 5 at Heathrow. So in my first meeting with the CEO, Sir John Egan, he basically said to me, if we don't solve this problem, building Terminal 5 could hold the company below the waterline. So my job was to find a way of designing and building airport infrastructure, and in particular Terminal 5, that would put our construction costs on the same trajectory as our charges to our customers. At least minus 2% per annum. So that I always found that was just having that very simple idea. Simple. It was one of those things I often try and explain to my children, the difference between simple and easy, and the difference between difficult and complicated. This was a simple thing that was very difficult to do.
Very.
But so what we did, we quickly concluded that the traditional way of delivering infrastructure, designing and building airport infrastructure, wasn't going to work. There were a number of reasons for that. I mean, the first one we realized by looking across all of because we were at the time we were already spending about £500 million a year on infrastructure before Terminal 5. And by looking across all of those programs, we realized that our architects and consulting engineers that we used were terrific companies, and they knew a lot about designing buildings, but they didn't know much about planning airport infrastructure to optimize operational efficiency. They, how could they? They didn't own an airport. So, and the second thing, we realized was that our construction managers and contractors, who were excellent companies, and they knew a huge amount about, competitive tendering and getting lowest prices, but we discovered they knew very little about their supply chains and even less about their costs. It's always surprised me people go on about costs in construction. Most of the time people talk about prices, better prices, and they don't know why something costs what it does. Yeah. So that was the kind of starting point for it all. And we realized we'd have to think of a radically different way. So we put together a team, me and some of my colleagues and a little support team, and we did what the boss suggested we do. We went off around the world, and we spent a lot of time traveling. We spent a lot of time visiting other people, and we spent a lot of time on our own, just deeply thinking. We used to have a once a month, 1 day meeting Funny enough, we used to hold it in the conference room at the chief engineer's golf club, which just happened to be a convenient place to go. And it was absolutely sacred that day for all of us to be there. And sometimes we'd only talk and work for a couple of hours and then go for a walk around the golf course. And other times we got there at 8 o'clock and were still there at 8 o'clock at night. But that was the kind of way we did it. And along the way, just as an aside, one of the things I did was to join the Lean Construction Institute in the US, and which is where I met Todd Zabel. I can remember it vividly. On a beautiful morning, we were meeting at Stanford, and on a beautiful morning, there was this breakfast table laid outside, and there was this larger-than-life character with a large piece of melon in his hand. And he said, "Hi, I'm Todd Zabel," and we've been friends ever since.
Oh my, wow!
So the solution we came up with to delivering our infrastructure had really a lot's been written about, a lot's been said about it. It had 4 very simple principles. The first one was that we, the airport owner, had to lead the design and construction. You know, that was the first starting point, and particularly the design and construction of Terminal 5. And crucially, we had to build inside the organization the capability to do that. We had quite a lot of capability already, but we had to adapt our capabilities. I'll give you one very simple example. Yeah. We had a large team of very good project managers and commercial managers who managed the traditional way. And we had to restructure the commercial organization and turn it into a supply chain organization. That took us the best part of a year to do, because we added a lot of capability too. So that was the first point. We had to become what we now call a capable owner. Second principle is we had to establish our own project process. So when I got there, every project was run differently according to who the consultants and the construction managers were. And none of them was run, people did it with the best of intentions, but none of them were run in our interests in that sense. So it took us a year we created our own BAA project process, trained hundreds of people to use it. The third thing we did is the third principle was that we recognized we had to contract directly with our key suppliers so that we could access their knowledge about how they made things and how their products performed. And also, that was where a huge amount of efficiency came from, direct relationships with suppliers. So we let a series of framework agreements. While we were planning Terminal 5, we were building at all the airports. I can't remember, we used to buy something like, was it 30 or something elevators and escalators and travelators a year. So it was some big number like that. So we let framework contracts for things like elevators and things like travelators and escalators. And through that, letting those contracts directly with the companies, we discovered all sorts of inefficiencies in our system. So for example, I remember the first contract for escalators and travelators went to a company called OMK, you probably know, and we said, we want your standard escalator and your standard travelator, please. And we're not going to write a very big specification. And they were absolutely surprised. They said nobody's ever asked for the standard one before. They always send us a great specification and we have to adapt the standard. So we realized immediately there was inefficiency. So
Simon, before this, you typically used a GC and they subcontracted all the supplies?
Would write a great big book and send us a big bill for writing the book, which would have pages and pages of specifications. And then you give the general contractor, or most of ours were construction managers rather than general contractors. And then the construction manager would go out to bid, and 5 firms would bid to provide the escalators, and every single company would have to adapt its standard product to meet our specification.
Understood.
So we learned, so not only did we get better products, more reliable products, we got knowledge. We got a huge amount of knowledge through those relationships. One of the things, as an aside, that we did was to say that all meetings with our suppliers would take place in their offices or factories, not in ours. We stopped all this business about ringing up suppliers and saying, I want to see you in my office. We went there. Massive amounts of knowledge came out of that by just being there with them, spending, during the lunch break going and having a look at the factory.
Sure.
So those are the first two. And then the final one is one that I think you'll be most interested in is we recognized that we had to have a production system. One of the things that struck us in the research we did is that nowhere on our then, existing projects was there a proper production system. There was a project management system, but that's not a production system. And we also realized we had to have a logistics operation to support the production system so that we could do work efficiently. So that was really, and we, I took the proposal to the BAA main board, and I remember it took quite a long time to persuade them, several meetings, that this was the thing we were going to do. And eventually they said, okay, we get it. And I always remember the parting shot was, after they'd agreed to it, was, but don't practice on Terminal 5. You're not going to start building Terminal 5 for several years. So go and practice on the existing programs.
Yeah.
That was an inspired thought, because we learned so much. The idea was, by the time we got to Terminal 5, we'd be quite good at this.
Excellent. Well, that was insightful. So as you implemented these 4 things, how did the organization respond? Did you get some resistance? Did you get, let's get on board and do it? What was the response from the organization?
What was interesting about organizations that came out of the public sector, these companies have been privatized only 6 years before. You had some remarkably able people, incredibly, and you had all sorts of people who were used to working in organizations where there were no prizes for taking risks. One of the things that happened in all of this was that my boss, John Egan, said I needed a mentor. And I think he also needed somebody to keep an eye on me. So we brought in somebody you probably have heard of, Dan Jones of Cardiff Business School, who wrote The Machine That Changed the World, where one that co-authored it. And I remember asking Dan, Dan studied Toyota and he'd done all this stuff, and I remember asking Dan one day, sort of, how do you actually affect change? Thinking about the question you raised about how do you deal with people in the company who don't want to do this, and the enthusiasts. And Dan said, he's such a lovely guy. It surprised me what he said. He said, look, in any company I've been into, there's 10% of the people who are missionaries. They will support you. They desperately want to do what you want to do. Yeah. They will do it without any supervision. There are 10% of the people who are trying to stop you. They just want to undermine you, and they will. It's very, very difficult to change them. And then there's 80% of people sitting in the middle of the seesaw, sitting there wondering what's going to happen, wondering which way to turn. And so I said, so what do you do with the 10% of people who are going to try and stop you? And he said, it's simple, you get rid of them, because you just don't have the time or energy to be able to persuade them otherwise. And it meant that I don't think many people got fired in the sense. Many people were deployed onto other things where their traditional skills would be better used. Yeah. So the answer to your question is, we had a lot of mixed responses to this. People thought we had a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of mixed response. And one of the things we did it around the project process. We realized a lot of people were saying, particularly senior people in the operational side of the business, were saying, yeah, this is a good idea, because they knew the chief executive liked it. But whether or not they really thought it was a good idea was another matter. So one of my team had this inspired idea that we should produce a video. Back in the days of VHS videos, we should produce a video so that when we launched the BAA project process, everybody would get a copy of the video. And we hired the other bit of inspiration he said, I don't know many people who won't be impressed by being interviewed by a very attractive TV presenter. So we hired a very good TV presenter. She did the interviewing. And neither me nor none of my staff were in the video. So we went around interviewing people and getting all these vox pops, as they're known over here. So you got the managing director of this and the managing director of that all saying, this is a fantastic idea, I fully support this. Yeah. Put it all into a video, made, I can't remember how many 100, if not 1,000 copies, and dished it out to everybody in the business and in British Airways and in the airlines. So the expression we used, we said, now everybody's got their fingerprints on this. And everybody's seen the video, so they can't turn around and say, I didn't support this, or it wasn't a good idea.
No, I didn't know about it. Yeah.
Exactly. And I learned a lot from that. I mean, I wasn't, the person who in my team who came up with these ideas, his background wasn't in engineering. He was more, general business kind of guy. Yeah. So I learned a lot from that. And I think it's something we could all learn from, because we tend to be, people like me and you and all of us guys who came up through engineering and construction and so forth, we tend to be very kind of task focused and very, very keen on developing the right idea and the right solution. And I think we're often undermined by people who operate on a different plane.
Tell me more about that.
Well, people, just because we're right doesn't mean everybody's going to want it, are they? And that's half. I mean, one of the things in all the years I've worked with Todd, and we've talked about this many, many times, when, in spite of the fact we have demonstrated many times the efficiencies that can be delivered by a production approach to construction, we are still, how shall I put it? We're still operating on the fringes of the engineering construction sector. We largely through a lot of the effort you guys have put in, we've persuaded more and more modern companies to adopt this, but we're still not mainstream.
Yep.
And we have to ask why. And the answer is simple. The answer is that if you are a senior person in a large consulting firm or a large construction company, you don't have much interest in adopting a new idea that might threaten you.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, people have learned how to make the system as it exists today work for them.
Correct. And there's
not interested in changing it.
Yeah, in people's careers and people. I mean, I'm not criticizing people. I'm just observing the psychology of the situation.
Yeah, very much human nature. So, how did the Heathrow? I have some inside scoop, but tell me how the Heathrow Terminal 5 project worked out.
Well, I left just as we were getting into construction. Because I've kind of done my job. My job was to work out how to do it, and I had to decide: am I going to stick around for another 7 years or something? Or am I going to? And I had a fantastic team that sort of took it on and delivered it. No, we produced what I would say was one of the best airport terminals in the world. I mean, by any measure, it's one of the few airport terminals. It's got one of the shortest distances from the curbside drop-off to the departure lounge of any major airport in the world. Or major terminal in the world. And it was delivered, to plan. You're probably aware that on the day it opened, there was a lot of problems with baggage handling and delays and all the rest of it. And I wasn't around then. I've listened to and seen presentations from the people who were involved. And I think what I've concluded is the baggage handling system worked exactly as it should, did exactly what it should. The problem was that was coordination with the airlines, because it was very complex. You had to move British Airways in from 2 terminals into Terminal 5, and hundreds, if not hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of workers had to park in different places, catch the bus in a different place, get to work in a different place. And I think that was it, was the interface between the human side of the organization and the physical infrastructure that resulted in that problem. But, it got fixed within 24 hours, so it's hardly.
Yeah. Well, I think Terminal 5 was one of the few infrastructure projects in the world that met the objectives it set out to meet at the beginning. I mean, just think about project after project after project is delayed, costs more, has major problems, or is never even finished.
Yeah, and I mean, there's plenty of other, without naming names, there's plenty of other airports in the US and around the world, here in Europe, that have overrun dramatically and taken years longer than was expected. But people are very happy. I mean, the people are very happy with it as a terminal. If I look back, from my interest in creating projects and creating investments, the big problem with these terminals is they've become so large that there's no way of breaking them down and implementing them in stages. So if I look back my whole time at BAA, the investments that were massively successful in terms of return on investment tended to be the incremental investment. So the extension of an existing terminal, that kind of extension of a baggage hall. Problem in all infrastructure is when you have to make another one. So you had to make a new terminal, you had to have new railway connections, new transit connections, all of that. And that becomes such a big investment. I suspect it must have been extremely difficult, even though Terminal 5 has been open for many years, just with the pandemic and the disappearance of aviation for a couple of years. It must have been very difficult for BAA to keep that huge building operating.
Yeah. Well, that leads us nicely into the next area I want to probe a little bit. In 2017, you co-authored the Infrastructure Clients Group report. It's a great report. From transactions to enterprises. I've read it. It's a really nice piece of work. I can see now that I hear the conversation, I can hear many things that I read in this report now about your views on how to make infrastructure projects more successful. Can you tell your audience about this report, how it came about, and the kind of key changes you were recommending in this report?
Well, it came about, its origin was in 2010 when we had a general election in the UK. Mm-hmm. And we had a new government, a coalition between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. And they, like the Labour government before them, commissioned a piece of work to look at infrastructure and how it was delivered. And particularly they looked at cost of infrastructure. They were concerned that we were spending too much in the UK compared to other countries developing our infrastructure. Yeah. And it was called the Infrastructure Cost Report, and it came out. And then they decided, and it concluded that that infrastructure in the UK cost up to 40% more than in comparable European economies. Whichever way they cut it, if you looked at labour rates, or if we were spending more than anybody else. Yeah. And so they, as a result of that, one of the things they did was to create an organisation called the Infrastructure Client Group to explore ways of improving the delivery of infrastructure, and it was mostly people, construction directors from the big infrastructure companies, the big infrastructure owners. By then I had moved out of that, and I was chairman of a construction company, but they invited me along as well because of my background, I think. Mm-hmm. We worked on all sorts of interesting things for a few years, but we never really came up with a new way of doing it. And so in 2000, I think it was around 2015, the government said, well, look, can you guys actually, I think various people have been saying to them, the current model doesn't work. I understand many of the big European contractors were saying to them, this whole way you do stuff here doesn't work. We can't make reasonable profits. We can't invest in our businesses. And that was the general atmosphere. Anyway, the result of it was the government said, will you guys just see if you can find a better way of delivering these big infrastructure programs? And my colleague, Miles Ashley, who was then construction director of London Underground, he was tasked with doing this. And he said to me, will you help me? He was also so busy, basically he said, will you go and organize it? Yeah. So and it was great fun working together and working with a lot of other colleagues. And what we did, the study that gave rise to the report was based on detailed analysis of 6 infrastructure projects that we chose. Mm-hmm. And what we did was choose projects that had either been successful or that were set out to be successful and somehow went wrong. What we did was the research was essentially based on interviews with people throughout the organizations that delivered these 6 projects, right from the owner all the way down to tier 3 suppliers. Yeah. And we got we engaged UCL, University College London, to do all of the research for us, and we made a big decision to use social scientists and not project managers. They have quite a big project management operation at UCL, but we used their social scientists. Got a completely different view of the world from the social scientists, from the social science techniques they used. The results were quite surprising when we analysed all of the interviews. What we discovered that most people in the project teams wanted to do a good job, yeah, and wanted to be efficient. Mm-hmm. They didn't come to work to mess around. They didn't come to work to stand looking at the ceiling. They wanted to get the job done, be proud of what they'd done, and get out of there. And the reasons they gave for this not working, or the reason they gave, because we asked them, why can't you do that? And it was basically down to the inadequacy of the project organizations they worked in. And when we got right in amongst it, we discovered that these organizations, so when you look at an organization that's delivering, I don't know, one of them was a big piece of sea defense. Yeah. When you look at it, it is actually what we call a virtual enterprise. So it's like a large company made up of people from lots of different companies, but the project team is an enterprise. And what we discovered was the project managers that were running these organizations were totally focused on what we call transactions. They were totally focused on letting and managing contracts, and were paying very little attention to running the organization. All the usual things. If you joined a company, all the usual things you'd expect, like an email address and a desk, and access to human resources and a canteen kind of thing. I mean, talk about the basics, but all of that kind of stuff wasn't being really dealt with professionally. And so we came to this conclusion that if we really wanted to improve delivery projects, we had to do less of the transactions and more professional management of the enterprise, which is why the report is called From Transactions to Enterprises. We weren't saying you don't need contracts. Of course you need contracts, yeah. But the contract is not a good vehicle for driving improvement and driving performance. Yeah. That's done through organizations and people. Mm-hmm. So that was the big conclusion. And when we got in amongst it, we were right in amongst the information and the analysis, working with UCL, we came to the conclusion that there were really 5 features, we now call them pillars, 5 things that if you got them right would create a well-run project enterprise. I won't go into a lot of detail. The first one, which won't surprise you, was you had to have a capable owner. Mm-hmm. And we learned that at BAA. We learned that on Terminal 5. So if you can't just have. I'm very suspicious of this term, the client. The client is a party to a contract. Mm-hmm. The owner is somebody who has a business and needs something doing to expand his business or to move on. So we decided we wouldn't use the word client at all, and we talked about the owner and the capable owner. Second thing we reckoned is that you need good governance. And we discovered that actually the project management organizations and project management-led organizations are usually not particularly good at governance. You see this, people discover too late that they're behind schedule and, ahead of their budgets. And so that became a subject. We realized that the corporate world, big businesses, were much better at governance than the project world. So that became a second. Yeah. Third one we looked at was integration. The traditional project management approach of breaking things down into packages and having contracts and all the rest of it, and then trying to coordinate them through some vast, ugly, complex critical path program just doesn't really work. And but what it does is to create disintegration. So we decided that we ought to run an enterprise so that everybody was integrated, and particularly so that we integrated information and processes. Organization, we talked about that. We decided we thought that a fundamental principle was to have a really effective organization. And then the last one was we've called digital transformation. This is going back, let's say, about 6 years now. We were very aware that the construction industry and the engineering construction sector and the infrastructure sector were way behind the pace when it came to the use of digital technologies. And when you spoke to people about this, they said, oh, well, we've all got BIM and things like this. BIM isn't what we were talking about. We were talking about using digital technologies to fundamentally change the way you run organizations and the way you do things. So those were the 5: capable owner, governance, integration, organization, and digital transformation. And I think, we might be able to, when we put this online, include a link to the report, which will enable people to get.
Well, that's a good idea. It is a good read. So what's happened since the report was written? Have these recommendations been taken up and embraced? Is a change occurring?
We were very surprised at the speed with which the report got recognition within governments and within the construction industry and within the infrastructure sector. Very surprised. It just took off, and people. When we wrote it, funnily enough, we originally had a rather long and tedious technical report, and we completely rewrote it to be. The brief was that we gave ourselves was this needs to be something that a board member or a senior civil servant can read on the train going home.
Yeah. Yeah, well done, because it is that way. It's a nice,
so
it's
you
an
can't
easy.
read it on a 45-minute train journey. They're not going to read it anyway. So we raced like that. It took off. We were very pleased with that. We created an organization. People can access the website for the people who are involved in using it. Currently, the last count, I think we had 20 adopters, organizations that are actually actively using it. And those, some really, really big programs are being run on it right now, like in national highways, they're running the Smart Motorways program, regional investment program, I think is £9 billion. Those are being run on Project 13 principles. It hasn't spread out into the wider construction industry as we had hoped it would, for all the reasons we spoke about earlier. So big owner-led programs are using it. It's kind of, for some reason I don't understand, but I'm very pleased about it. It's kind of taken off in Australia and New Zealand. So there's a number of companies in Australia and New Zealand using it. And there's a lot of interest in it in Hong Kong as well. So I would say better than I expected, not as good as I'd hoped.
Okay. So one thing that it didn't jump out at me, so I'll poke a little bit. I didn't see anything about creating that production system, being deliberate about the project production system. Is that implied in here somewhere, or you were just dealing with trying to get the basics in place first so that the organization could be aligned around something?
I think both. The answer is yes to both of those. First of all, it is implied in there.
Yeah.
When you get into to integration and organization, in order to integrate, you have to integrate your processes. So you arrive at the point of wanting a production system. Yeah. We were reluctant to get too much down into the next level of detail. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we would bust the brief we gave ourselves of wanting a report that could be read on a train journey.
Yeah.
So we wanted to keep it at a high level of principle, the report itself.
Yeah. Okay.
Certainly, the companies that are implementing it are all looking at some form of improvement in production. Whether it fulfills, the definition you and I would have of a full production system is another matter. But everybody recognizes that we've got to manage production effectively if we're going to get the result.
Yeah, you can't just manage contracts. You have to manage how the work is being done. Yeah.
So that and I keep going. But funny enough, when we were doing the final edits and all the rest of it, there was quite interesting debates because when the government was running the infrastructure client group, the civil servants from our Treasury, Ministry of Finance, they had a spreadsheet with all of our projects. So when it came to this one, it was number 13 on the list. So it was always known as Project 13 by everybody working on it, and everybody talked about Project 13. And so when we came to publish it, people said, "Oh, you can't have Project 13 on it." And I said, "Why not? Everybody's talking about it." So that's how it became, the strap line was from transactions to enterprises, and it became known as Project 13. And I'm pleased we did that because it's got a lot of recognition as a result of that.
I was going to ask you, where did Project 13 come from? What did that mean? Now you answered the question. That's
the next line on the spreadsheet.
It's the line on the spreadsheet. That's fantastic. Well, man, a lot has happened in Europe since you published this report. You recently sent me a link to some aspirations that the UK has on the energy transition and becoming self-sufficient. And of course, the current what's going on in Europe and with Russia right now are weighing heavy on people's mind. What are the challenges that are facing promoters of infrastructure projects today, and what changes are needed to address them? There's a pretty big aspirations in that report.
I was thinking the other day, saying to one of my friends, I graduated nearly 50 years ago, and in all the time I've been working, I have never known a time of greater uncertainty in the environment we work in.
Yeah.
I would say the direct answer to your question is the single biggest challenge that we face predated all of the recent events, and that is decarbonizing our infrastructure to meet all of the ambitious goals that governments have set, in the UK, in the US, and Europe. That is the biggest challenge facing everybody in the world, I think, right now. And it is massive. For more than a century, we've developed all of our roads and railways and airports and electricity supply systems and all of that. We've developed it all around coal, oil, and gas as the primary energy source. And consequently, all those infrastructure systems are configured to make it efficient to use coal, oil, and gas. So in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in the US, until relatively recently, we had massive, great coal-fired power stations sitting in the middle of the country with the electricity distribution system radiating out from them. The big challenge around decarbonizing infrastructure is that we have to restructure our infrastructure networks to operate using clean energy. And I mean, there's a few deep thinkers. We have a professor at Oxford, Savita Helm, who thinks a lot about these things. He's just written a book about this recently. And he's saying to the government, you've got to get real. This is lots of money and huge amounts of money, far more than anybody's opening up to right now, and a lot of resource, huge amounts of resource. So this was, reconfigure our networks to achieve the decarbonization targets and to achieve emissions targets rather, was always going to be a huge task, an expensive task. And recent events have just made it much, much more difficult. So if I take them in order, in the UK, Brexit has undoubtedly restricted the supply of labour to the engineering construction sectors. And it's going to take several years to correct that, either by greater investment in productivity, greater investment in equipment, in machinery to automate things, or by it could be a combination of that and training people, developing people. One of many things in the UK we've been very bad at for many years has been technical education. We're very good at the university level, but we are nowhere near other European countries or indeed the US when it comes to training technicians. So I think that Brexit started the problem by restricting labour supply. The COVID pandemic, I think we're all aware it's disrupted global supply chains and it's disrupted shipping. I was seeing on the news this morning, I can't remember, there are many large container ships sitting outside the port of Shanghai waiting to be unloaded right now because COVID has infected so many people that they haven't got guys to drive the cranes. So COVID has disrupted this global supply chains, and it's also restricted the supply of labour. So you've seen an awful lot of people deciding to retire early. I think what pandemic did is it caused people to bring forward decisions they were going to make anyway. Decisions about retiring early, decisions about changing their job, and so forth, which is why we've had these very, very high rates of staff turnover in companies. Now, so those two are going to be pretty difficult to deal with anyway. And now we have the first full-scale war in Europe in 75 years to deal with too. And that has already disrupted the supply of labour and materials. And crucially, it's had a kind of double whammy effect. It's further constrained the supply chains because Russia and Ukraine between them are major suppliers of steel and aluminium and all sorts of specialist things in the case of Ukraine. But at the same time, as disrupting the supply chains, it's caused us to accelerate plans to decarbonize infrastructure in order to wean ourselves off dependency or reliance on Russia as a source of oil and gas. So you've seen the report that was produced by the British government recently, which is talking about big investment in nuclear power, big investment in, or some investment in hydrogen. But essentially what it's all but saying is we've got to accelerate what's going to be difficult anyway to get away from hydrocarbons. Germany's going through a similar process right now. I was talking to a colleague of mine in Stuttgart. He was saying that people have done calculations to say that the amount of investment that will be needed to reduce Germany's dependence on Russian oil and gas is roughly the current turnover of their entire engineering construction sector.
Wow.
So they're merely doubling the output. So these are big numbers. And I think it not only has this sort of, these events made what was already a difficult problem of decarbonizing our infrastructure and made it really, really big. I think it's a problem that's beyond the capacity and capabilities of our traditional approach to managing, designing and building projects.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, if you think about it, the way we do things here in the UK, and I think it's pretty similar in the US, is that our methods assume open markets and they assume efficient markets. So this idea of breaking a project down into its component parts and going to the markets and letting a contract, it assumes you're going to an open and efficient market.
Yeah.
And the problem when you put this level of demand on a market, double or triple the amount of demand you're placing on it, is it is no longer an open and efficient market. And if we're not careful, what we'll end up with is very large increases in prices, defaults from contractors. I'm hearing this already here in the UK. Contractors refusing to bid, so forth, because the risks are much, much too high. So I suppose now I would say now is the time when we have to make significant changes, to the way we go about doing these things. I don't yet, this has all happened in a matter of weeks. I don't yet know enough about it to be able to speak with confidence about the scale of those changes. What I do know, as I say, is we can't carry on as we have been. And I think the other thing is, so we not only have to change our approach to build, we have to dramatically reduce the resources we use to create infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because those resources are constrained, whether you're talking about labor, materials, or whatever. You have to dramatically reduce this. We have to become much, much more flexible so that we use alternative products and alternative skills in it. The other thing which is, I think, becoming evident is that we're going to have to accelerate the digital transformation of our infrastructure services so that they become much more effective at managing demand as well as managing supply. So what we've all done traditionally, whether it's transport or energy or aviation or whatever, is we've, what I've done all through my career is we've employed lots of clever people to forecast the demand for something, how many flights will be going out of Heathrow, how much electricity will be used in New Jersey and so forth. And then we've used those demands to justify supply. So to meet that demand, we've got to do this. I don't think it's going to work like that. I don't think you're going to solve the problem like that. I think we're going to have to become much, much cleverer at managing demand. So we're going to have to create some what I would call real-time marketplaces. A very simple example of that would be, currently in the UK, we have some fairly basic electricity tariffs. So if you use electricity, I don't know, between midnight and 5 a.m. or something, it's much cheaper than in the middle of the day. But if you look at if we accelerate the process of decarbonisation, we're going to roughly double the amount of electricity that's circulated, because all that energy that's being supplied through diesel and petrol or gasoline and so forth is going to become electricity. Now, what we're going to have to do is think very proactively about how we can put in place digital relationships between households and their electricity suppliers so that you can almost have a live market. So I'll give you a very simple example would be, if we carry on electrifying our automobiles at the rate we are right now, we're going to end up with huge storage capacity of electricity driving around on four wheels. And that storage capacity comes home and is plugged into your house. So we now need to get to a place where we have the digital technology that enables us to not only offer a householder a cheap price for using electricity in the middle of the night, but actually offer the householder the opportunity to sell the electricity in their car back to the grid when there's a lot of demand.
Interesting.
I was talking to one of our sons who works in the car industry. He works actually in the car industry in California. And he was saying, I was asking him this because I've done some numbers on it, and I said, I don't believe the numbers I've calculated of what, if all of our internal combustion engine cars were replaced by battery electric vehicles. I calculated, I think the total amount of storage capacity would be something like twice the average daily demand in the UK.
Wow.
So I said, I don't believe these numbers. Can you check them? So he checked them and he said, my son said to me, he said, "Dad, go online and look at the adverts, Ford's advertisement for is it the F-150 Lightning truck?" Mm-hmm. He said, "It's brilliant. There's a bit in there where I was so clever at Ford. Ford is saying one of the selling points of this truck is you can actually plug it into your house. And if your truck's fully charged, you can run your house off the truck for about, I think it's about 3 days."
I've seen the advertisement. It's interesting. Yeah.
So, but you can see how, how we're going to get into a place where real-time management of demand. I mean, you can apply the same to transport systems. So currently in London, we have contactless payments for buses and the underground and trains. I am told the technology exists for Transport for London to send, if I was working up in town and there was a big demand by passengers, the technology exists where they could send me a text saying, if you leave your journey until after 6:30 p.m., you can have it half price. Now that exists, that technology. We're not using it, but there's there's no technical reason why you can't do that. So those are very my big tips. I think we're going to find a way. I think this is a real big challenge. We've got to find a way of delivering our infrastructure much more cheaply. Yeah. Or I'd use it using much less resource would be a better way of putting it.
So perhaps this is an opportunity to help project production management become mainstream and a part of the backdrop of, or the backbone of delivering projects with far less, resources, far less cost, faster, etc. Any thoughts on how we can help move that direction?
I can't see us cracking this problem without adopting production.
I can't either. Yeah, traditional methods aren't going to get you there.
They're not going to get us there. So I mean, it's we don't have to look further than the automotive industry in the 1920s to realize that the massive savings they made in the use of resource that enabled Henry Ford to reduce the price of a Model T. I think it was from like $700 to $250. Yep. That was all achieved through production management.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. I can't sort of. I can't say, a particular type of production management is what we need, but we definitely need to manage the process.
Yeah. Well, any thoughts on how PPI can play a role in that?
Well, it goes back to, the thing PPI is achieving, I think is being, a place where ideas are developed.
Yeah.
It goes back to what I was saying about influence being much more interesting than power.
It is.
PPI doesn't have a lot of power, but it has a heck of a lot of influence. And the more you carry on doing what you're doing right now, Gary, the more influence it will have.
All right. Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation, Simon. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you volunteering to spend some time with us. And what an interesting life you have, an interesting role you have, and an influence position in the UK, and I suspect beyond the UK.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and do give my regards to all my friends in PPI.
I will do that. Thank you, Simon.